Well, hello guys, this is David Vos here, and I'm sitting here in Alabama pondering some amazing thoughts, and as usual I sit here and I wonder just what's about to come out of my mouth because, you know, how to tell the story. We've been lied to so deeply that I think if I told you the truth just straight up, you'd probably just turn this off and walk away and never listen to me again. But in spite of that, and running the risk that I'm going to lose all my subscribers, I'm going to go ahead and do it. I'm going to tell you the truth. It's got to be done. Somebody's got to hear it. And I know from history and I know from logic that the truth will always win. The truth will set you free. And nothing but the truth, so help you God. The truth is that what we've been told about our history, about religion, about the divine being, about ourselves, and just about everything else, it's all been lie. All been lie. And the way they achieve that lie in the minds of men is that they have to have an understanding to start with that's a bit greater than ours. They have to keep us in the dark, and then they know what actually happened. See, they know what happened. How else would they be able to hide that from you if they didn't know? If you've got a city that you need to defend, you need to know that the city's there, but you don't want the enemy to know it's there. So you camouflage it. That's why people that are in war and battles, they camouflage themselves. They're trying to deceive you, but what are they trying to do? They're trying to stop you from knowing who they are. Why? Because if you don't know who they are and where they are, then they can come and get you and pick you off from the hillside, from the mountaintop, from their watchtower. They're watching you. Why do you think they built those watchtowers? To watch for us, the enemy. We're the enemy. We're just the naive. We're the meek that's going to inherit the earth, so we're not prepared for battle. We're turning the other cheek. We assume everybody else is wonderful and loving. How naive. But you see, the battle is not for, if it were a physical battle, they'd lose. Because we're the people, the masses, and it never was about that. We could have won that battle, and so we were under the illusion that, well, look at all these guns they've got. All the military and all the police. Why, there's nothing we can do. They've surrounded us. They've got all the laws. But you see, all the laws and all the guns and all the military cannot keep us in control. That's only the illusion. What's keeping us in control is the mind meld they've got on us. We're the ones that gave them the tax money to buy those guns. We're the ones who believe that it's for our own good that we have police. We're the ones, and they've taught us this propaganda. So this has always been a spiritual warfare. It's always been a spiritual battle. And the weapons of our warfare are never carnal, never were, never will be. Minds rule the world, not guns, not weapons, but minds. And ultimately, love conquers all. They had to get us angry. They had to defeat us so that we didn't have love anymore. They had to break us down, and they had to keep us stupid to do that. So one of the ways they do that today is that since they know that they're going to have this system where people can talk back and forth all around the world, knowledge shall increase and books shall be opened, the Bible says. And they know that it's a race for time, right? Because in time, we're all going to learn. So it's a race to get us imprisoned in our own mind or in our own degenerative mental disease. I mean, think about it. I mean, it's not just heart disease and cancer, which keeps us only living a few years rather than our potential. They've been doing this since Adam was, living thousands and thousands of years, not just 930, but thousands of years until, after the flood, maybe they lived a few hundred. Even in our Bible, Abraham's still 180 years old, and his father's 205. Even Noah, who lived 600 years before the flood, lives 100, long time after the flood. I don't remember exactly how long. And Shem and Ham, and these guys lived a long time. They were the gods. And then by the time of Moses, what did he live? 120 or something? And then by the time you get down to David's time, the generation was 70 or 80 years. Well, up until recently, it's been about 70 or 80 years. Well, as long as, you didn't fall off a horse or break your leg or fall off a canyon or go to war and battle and all of that. But if you stayed home and, had relative easy life, you could live to be 100. But now recently, they've done something to make certain it's another. Well, they did it in history for thousands of years. They introduced this thing called disease. In the Old Testament, Yahweh said he's the one who brings the disease. And he told his people, he said, listen, if you go kill everybody and do what I say and bring me all the gold, I will not put the diseases that I put on the Egyptians upon you. And the diseases came from, bugs, parasites, like there were frog plagues, there was fly plagues, there were gnat plagues, there were all kinds of crazy plagues, and then the death of their firstborn. Somebody just mentioned that to me earlier today. They asked me like, hey Dave, they're in Exodus where it says, Exodus 22 verse 29 and 30, where it says, Yahweh says, I want you to give me all your firstborn of your sheep and your firstborn of your cattle and also your own children, your firstborn children. Give them all to me. Well, what was he going to do with those firstborn children? Well, the same thing he was going to do with the firstborn of the oxen and the firstborn of the sheep. He was going to kill it and eat it. Oh man, I know, it's crazy. What did they do with the sacrifice? They ate it. The sheep, the cattle, they ate them, right? They offered them on an altar. What's that? A barbecue pit. Well, what was this firstborn that they offered on the altar? Was not Isaac strapped on an altar? Do you ever seen the pictures with Abraham and the knife and he was going to slice his neck and bleed him out there and burn him on this rock fire pit? What was he going to burn him up there for? Well, it tells you in the Old Testament they would take the fatty pieces, the liver, the heart, and all these, and the blood would give to the Lord. What did he do with it? Well, it says it was a sweet-smelling savor to his nostrils. I don't know. What do you think he did with it? He sat down and ate with Abraham, right, after he slaughtered the animals. And the priest got the shank, or the I don't know, like that pot roast, or, down there, I guess the best parts other than the fatty pieces and the blood. That was the best part. That was given to the Lord. And then the high priest got the hind leg or something, and then, the ribs and the less desirable parts that the person that was offering the thing got to eat that part. And it was like they shared it. They sat at the table. The Apostle Paul says the table of demons. But yeah, they sacrificed animals to eat them. And they gave the blood to the Lord. He didn't allow anyone else to have the blood or the fatty pieces. Do you know that? You are not, if you are going to follow the Old Testament, well, we're going to follow the Old Testament, Dave. It's a moral law that we're all under. Well, then you're going to have to eat meat, and not just eat meat, but you can never eat fat. Can't eat at McDonald's because they got fat in there. You're not allowed to eat the fat. You got to give that to the Lord, or the blood. So therefore, you'd have to eat all kosher. So if you're going to disregard the law of Moses in one area, you got to disregard it in every area. And then, unless you know the truth about what Jesus said, that we're all under his grace, then you're really screwed, because you also got to give your firstborn son and eat his flesh. And it tells you that, Yahweh says, because you didn't obey me, one day I'm going to come and force you to eat your own children. But you see, let's not go there right now. What I'm telling you is that I guess it seems like the only way to get people to listen is to shock them with the truth. It's like, well, we're keeping the 10 Commandments, Dave, don't you? Why, it's moral. Okay, the first commandment, you get down on your knees and worship me or I'll kill you. What's the second commandment? Oh, get down on your knees and worship me or I'll kill you. Okay, what's the third one? If you don't know my name and spell it right and get down and worship me, I'll kill you. Oh, okay. Well, what's the fourth one? Oh, you will be a slave for 6 days and do all your slaving for me for 6 days. You will not be allowed to have any rest during those days. You must perform your labor. But now, on the seventh day, that day we get to keep for ourselves. We can go out and do what we want. No. On that day, you have to go to some temple or something and read in the instructions, in the book of the instructions, not the law. It's the book of the instructions. You were instructed. And the priest got his instructions from the Lord, and he got all of you together on the Sabbath, and you had to read in an undertone day and night in the instructions and do everything you were told. And if you picked up a stick or did anything, like Jesus was plucking grains in the field, and him and his disciples, they say, hey, Jesus, how come you don't keep the Sabbath? You're plucking grains. And of course, Jesus said, oh, yes, I do. I just made a mistake. Let's make the law a little bit nicer, right? If you make mistakes, it's all right. That's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, oh, you're right. I don't keep the Sabbath. Your God's crazy. What kind of a deity? He asks for, bread and he gives you serpents, right? Bring the people to me. I have compassion on them. Jesus said, my Father keeps on working. He didn't rest. What did you guys, it's like, remember Elijah said to the Baal worshiping priest, he says, hey, call upon your deity and see if he'll answer you. And they're like cutting themselves and bleeding and screaming and crying and moaning and bashing their head against a wall. Please, oh Baal, come. And Elijah says, well, maybe we had to go to the bathroom. Maybe he's on a break. Maybe he's got to go to the privy. Right? Well, Jesus kind of did the same thing. He looked at the Sanhedrin. He's like, hey, what? Your God's got to rest? He's got to go to the bathroom? What does he got? What kind of deity is this? Because my Father is above, and your Father is from beneath. And as I said the other day, then he goes on to say, your Father is of this world, and my Father is from heaven, not of this world. My kingdom is no part of this world. So where is the beneath? It's here, on the ground. Anyway, we spent 13 minutes just kind of rambling here, but I want to get to something that is just completely blow your mind. Woo, boy, we're going to talk about some things we started telling you yesterday. A little bit about this thing called the Tartarians, okay? Now, I tell you why I don't really like that word, like some conspiracy called the Tartarian conspiracy. Because who are the Tartarians? It's like some conspiracy that we're learning that all it does is tells us, everything we've been taught is a lie, but now we've got something we don't understand that's really the truth, but doesn't edify us at all. Because I'm not a Tartarian, and you? Well, at least if I am, I didn't know I was, and so... it's like, what is that doing? What we're supposed to be doing is regathering the tribes, bringing back the truth, the knowledge. Who the fiddly diddly darn ding are we? I don't want to know about some word I don't know. Well, let's see now. What's a Tartarian? Well, let's see. Maybe it's a root word of the Tarts and the Aryans and I don't know. All right. Now, I'm not saying there weren't individuals that for a long period of time, you got a map and there's this Tartarian up at the top, and they had a land control bigger than any other kingdom on earth, bigger than China, bigger than India. There are maps that shows the Tartarians ruling all of Russia, down Mongolia, all the way past the Great Wall of China, part of India, and all up to Persia, and then, behold, even America says they controlled it. Well, that's one thing that we could talk about, and it's a deep thing, but that story is really what we've been saying. The children of Israel that were scattered all over the world, they were always out there. Oh, it's deep. We're going to get into that story too, because the children of Israel went east, west, north, and south. And the prophet Ezekiel was the prophet Buddha, and it tells you that in the Quran, and we can prove that. And I will get to that. I got so much we got to get to. And Daniel went to Persia. He became the head of the Magi. What is that? The Magi. Yeah? A magician? What is that? Modern propaganda. Just like the word witch. What does that mean? A wise woman? Oh, you can't be a wise woman. Oh, or a wizard. A wise man, right? Oh, what about a magician? Oh, that's forbidden, Dave. Well, that's not what you think it is. They're lying. The prophet Daniel was a magi. There were 3 magicians that came and saw the star that led them to Christ and said that the Son of the divine being was born. Well, what kind of a star leads you that? They're also called astrologers. Oh, are you telling me that the priesthood, Daniel, he's the wisest man that ever lived, I guess, other than Solomon, I guess. It says, are you as wise as Daniel, to the king of Tyre? And Daniel was reading, he had the Holy Ghost, right? He was doing the interpretation, which is greater than a prophet, Paul says. And, reading the handwriting on the wall and interpreting visions, because he was a magician, the chief head of all the magicians. Well, so was Moses, remember? Because Moses went to the magic practicing priests, the magicians in Egypt, and he threw down his staff and it became a serpent. Whoa, what does that mean? Well, it was the wisdom of the serpent. The deep, deep wisdom. Because the serpent was the wisest of all the creatures. Right? So, yeah. The magic practicing priests in Egypt, they threw down their staves and they became serpents too. But Moses' serpent ate theirs. Well, what is that saying? Well, it says that Moses had a higher priesthood than theirs. Whose priesthood is Moses? Well, Moses' father-in-law was Jethro, Ruel, and Jethro's daughter, Moses married him, and their child was Balaam. Right? And Balaam was a prophet. And there's a whole story in the Bible where he explains this prophecy of Balaam. And it was very accurate. But anyway, we're getting off into a lot of different things. But there's so much we don't know that we can read, but yet we still don't know it. Because of the way they twist it, the propaganda. So the prophets will be able to interpret all of these things. All the information you need is out there. It's just that when you go to school, they don't let you read that part. So we were talking about the Chalaga up there where today we call it Chicago. But it was originally called Chalaga. And we've got maps back to 1500 that show Chalaga. Right? We've got maps that in the 1600s that show Chalaga. And there ain't no Great Lakes there. There's no Great Lakes. We got pictures of this great city, Chalaga, in 1893. And if you guys want to believe that, Thomas Edison and the boys threw that thing up, some mason, right? Some Masonic. Who are these Masons? Well, that's what we're going to describe today. Who were these Masons? Because they went in there to Chicago and they had a World's Fair. And they said, oh, look, we're going to just build this big city in a few months. Oh, yeah, it's just built out of plaster and some sticks. Right? And then when we're done, we'll burn it. Well, we've got pictures of horses and chariots going over the bridges that they built with plaster and sticks. We have absolute proof if you watch that video that I put in the info box yesterday. It's a 2-hour It's worth the watch, but it will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there were grand cities in America before the Constitution was made in 1776. It was a city that rivaled Rome, Athens, or Constantinople, or any city, Athens, Alexandria, any big city, anywhere in the world. It was the largest, most magnificent. We're told it's just, they started building a little town there in something like 1850, right? There was like 50 people there. That's a big lie. There was a huge city, bigger than New York City at that time. I don't think it was as big as New York now, but it was certainly more beautiful. I mean, with domes and fountains and statues, and they had a skyscraper. That's the first city on earth where they recorded a skyscraper. It was not built by modern man. And I know a lot of you are like, what? Well, if you haven't seen that video, watch that and then come back. Just make sure you understand that that's real. St. Louis had a vast empire. There was a huge city where St. Louis is today. And then why St. Louis? Because there was a big gorge that starts where we got this thing called the Great Lakes. It used to be a big gorge. Starts in Nova Scotia. And you go down through where, Toronto and Chicago and Detroit and all these cities. Well, they were all there to start with. It was a whole civilization before we got here. All the way down to St. Louis, and guess what? Even further down the Mississippi and all the way to New Orleans. Big city. And you can find on ancient maps Nova down in the area where, right into Mexico, they call it Nova. What's that? Why is it called Nova? Nova Scotia down there? What's Nova Scotia doing down there? Because you see, before the group of individuals that came over here that made Washington, Columbus and all that, there was other people that came here. Do some research and you'll find that there, we keep talking about this, Mary Magdalene and Martial, France. And the history says that she came over on a boat, 72, and Lazarus was with her, and you know what we've talked about with Lazarus and who he was, Lazarus, right? He became the great knight, the protector of the Holy Grail, the protector of the Holy Textus Receptus. They translated it into common language. They preserved it. They held on to it tight. Now, the Romans were taken over by these Vikings in 405. And the apostasy, the great, the world, the whole civilized world was free before that. Up till 395 when they put out the flame, got rid of the Vestal Virgins and all the mysteries up in Antioch and, the Christian church, right? And Dionysius and the Artemis and the Eleusinian mysteries and all of that was the mysteries. That was Christianity, the Essenes. We've proven the Essenes were priests at the Temple of Artemis. So it all was taken over by the Vikings. The Goths, Batman from Gotham City, and all the vampires and all the dark and the evil, run by the fallen angels on Mount Hermon that got in the boat with Dan and went from Sidon. Yeah, it tells you in the Bible that Dan went to Laish and conquered it. That's Tyre, a few miles from Tyre. That's a big metropolis, Tyre and Sidon. They mention them together. And so Dan went to Laish, was the kingdom of Tyre, which is the kingdom of the devil, according to Ezekiel 28. And Dan conquered them, supplanted them, and renamed it Sidon. And then he got in his boat and he went to Sweden and up the Danube and the Dniester, and we've talked about all of that. And so he came down around on his ships, and the Roman Empire overtook Spain in 1492, and Columbus sailed the ocean blue with a 3 big ships full of Judeans, right? But they weren't the right ones, right? They got a red cross. They're coming from the Holy Roman Empire. Got a grant from Queen Isabella of Spain, who is now running Spain for the Vatican. And they expelled all the Judeans. Well, that was interesting because they put them in a boat. They didn't really want to expel them. Because at that point, it's very difficult to understand because there was a lot of obfuscation of facts, a lot of secrecy and infiltration. Because just before that, in 1308 or something like that, I don't remember, what is it? I can't remember the exact year. Was it 1307 or 1308? something like that. They went in and massacred the Templars. At that point, the Templars were the good guys. Yeah, they were the good guys. And they were fleeing persecution, so they massacred them all. Well, they went to Britain, Breton, in the northeastern corner. Now, interestingly enough, you'll find a little town up in Nova Scotia called Britain, and New Scotland, Nova Scotia. Well, who were those people? Well, they don't like to tell you that story very much. They got here before. They made peace with the Micmac Indians, right? And all the natives that are in Canada. And they were called Arcadians. That's where we get the word Canadians. Yeah, the Canadians are French. And that is Britain. I know it's kind of what? I thought Britain was England. No, Britain is in the northwest corner of France. And they named the city there in Britain Armorica. Yeah, Avalon and all the college there where they taught the scriptures, and it was like the Knights of the Round Table, you know, and King Arthur and all of this, and they were the knights, and what were they doing? Killing people and warring? They never did that. They followed the teachings of Jesus. They turned the other cheek, and they protected the Holy Grail. And here come the Romans on their tail, right? Coming up to massacre them. 1307 in France, in Paris, they were all massacred. So they all got on the boat from Britain, and they went to Scotland, to Sinclair. Yeah, Sinclair had some boats too. And these are the same boats, you know, Joseph of Arimathea, you know, Jesus' daddy, stepfather. He was a very powerful man, the Ptolemy, and they had boats, and they had descendants, and they owned all this wealth. And, you know, Mary Magdalene had lots of wealth because, you know, Cleopatra owned all the wealth and the gold from Egypt and France, you know, and originally Italy, and up the Palestine and into Syria and all Persia and India. That all wealth of the world practically was in the hands of Caesar. But after a while, the Vikings, they kept having wars, and the Vikings conquered Rome by 405, and that was all wiped out. And then they had some inquisitions later on and drove them out, you know, from Marseille, France, up the Rhone River, all the way up through France to Paris. Yeah, the Rhone River goes all the way to Paris, France. And Peter Waldo owned 169 cities, towns, and villages up the Rhone River. And he had all this wealth because he had all the wealth of, you know, his daddy Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And they didn't use it for themselves. They gave it to the people. The people were wealthy. They were all living in peace, as one accord, praying on their knees for the preservation of the truth, knowing that this was going to be a long battle, that the enemy was breathing down their neck. So they started taking these valuable things like the scriptures and the Holy Textus Receptus and the Holy Grail and all the, perhaps the Ark of the Covenant and everything else they may have had. Gold and jewels, but they didn't use it for what? You know, what's gold for? Is it for, you know, reveling in and plating your toilet seat? No, they didn't do that. They were trying to take it someplace safe and build the New Jerusalem. So they went to Britain and they built Avalon and built different places. And finally, the Lord said, okay, now we're going to America. And they got there in like 1500 and something like that. You can read the story, and there's Oak Island where they may have buried this treasure. Could be so, you know, to this day it's hidden. There were people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and Washington and other founding fathers that would go up there with spades and shovels trying to dig up treasure. Joseph Smith was a treasure digger, and people laugh at him and say, oh, he was a treasure digger. He was probably a Mason too. Yeah, he was. He was a Templar. They came over here. They didn't come over with the other guys. They were the Pilgrims, and another group that came over with, you know, on Sinclair's boat. New Scotland, Nova Scotia, and they built an empire from 1500. They made a constitution with the Micmacs and gave them their freedom. They lived in peace. They fought together in bloody wars against the British. But all that's been taken from our history books. I mean, it's there. You can go find it. But they don't put it in the book that you get where you're supposed to get a degree if you go to Stanford. But you can still find it. Go out there. The Lord's not going to make sure, let it disappear from history. We know what happened. Yeah, the French came over there. The French Acadians, that's the Canadians. And they made a civilization all the way down to New Orleans. I guarantee it. That's that whole, French, New Orleans, that kind of, what do they call it? Cajun? That word Cajun, the Cajuns, that comes from Arcadian. Now, how did they get all the way down there in Louisiana? Well, take a look at those old maps. Nova Scotia is up here, and that gorge that wasn't the Great Lakes in 1500. I don't know when it became lakes or what happened with that. But all the maps just show this big, huge gorge and all these castles. Sort of like European castles that represented cities on the map. Well, why, if they're all a bunch of Native Americans and living in teepees, that they got a map with these big cities called Chicago and Nova Scotia written down there by New Orleans and into Mexico? And St. Louis is depicted as a big castle in the big city. And we've got pictures of St. Louis with skyscrapers and domes. It looks like Vatican. It looks like Athens, Greece on steroids. We got pictures all over. I mean, these individuals went to San Diego, San Francisco. They were major cities. Why do when I was a kid, I remember I heard the story of how San Francisco burned to the ground. The whole town. Like, well, once the fire got started, we just couldn't stop it. It just burned everything. The whole city. Huh? Oh, it's terrible. Why? Seriously? If one building burns, the whole town's going to burn? I don't think so. Especially when you find out that San Diego burned down and, and St. Louis just burned down to the ground and, Chicago burned to the ground. New York burned to the ground. Everything burned to the ground. Cities in Berlin and cities are all around the world. It's all burned down around 1900, 1890s. Because then that's when they were introducing Tesla and saying, oh, look at Edison, Tesla. We've got all this new technology. We got to have a reset. We got to destroy the old world order and make it look like that these idiots that came over here and started Columbus that made the District of Columbia and put there was no Washington, D.C. in 1776. They built that years later and changed the whole Constitution. Our founding fathers were Templars. Yes, they were. They were Masons. But I'm going to tell you a story. Because a lot of people ask, well, Masons are all the same. What are you talking about, Dave? There were no good Masons. Oh, yeah, they were. What makes you think they were bad? Why do you think the Catholic Church murdered them all in 1307 or whatever year it was? I can't remember what year. Oh, sorry, I'm doing this from the top of my head. Well, you see, we know where the Knights started from, with Mary Magdalene. It's all in the books. It's in the history books. And we know that they fled from persecution. We know that the Catholics murdered them. And we know that they went to Scotland and made the Scottish Rite. Okay? So they came to America and the Scottish Freemasons were all good. Well, right around 1900, 1860, 70, there was a man named Albert Pike who wrote the book called The Morals and Dogma. Well, who is this Albert Pike that, basically redid Freemasonry and changed it and introduced a thing called the York Rite? Oh, that's weird, because there's such a thing called New York? Oh, there's a New Scotia, Nova Scotia, and then there's a New York. Well, Scotland's a little different than the York of up there in Britain, where Dan built London, right? But what most people don't know, because nobody knows, and they don't tell you this, and they don't want you to know this, But the York Rite was completely made up in America from a people who came from York and made a New York. In fact, there's another little town of York in Maine. And these individuals they weren't Masons, they were Illuminati. The Illuminati was formed in 1776 in Bavaria by Adam Weishaupt, a continuation of a guy named John Dee and Edward Kelly that brought up this evil from the bottomless pit, and polygamy and wife swapping and rituals and pedophilia and evil and a plan to take over the world. They didn't have any, Masonry. They had to infiltrate. They had to murder them and kill them, and then after they murdered them, they go, hey, why don't we just start up another group called Rosicrucians with a red cross and pretend we're them. We won't change it drastically right away. We can't just come in and say, hey guys, all you people that believe in the Lord Jesus, we're going to start serving Satan now, and we're going to kill everybody. Oh, okay, well let me sign up for that. No, they couldn't do it that way. See, so up until about the remember Joseph Smith died in 1844. Brigham Young killed him. Brigham Young was a Mason, but he wasn't from the group like Washington, wasn't of the Scottish Rite. It was this new group of Jesuits coming in to infiltrate. And they had a lot of money. They were Columbus, who had these 3 big boats full of Judeans. And they weren't they weren't the ones over there in the Iberian Peninsula that was the good guys. No, this was that group over there in Spain that made the Kabbalah, right? The upside down cross and the 6-sided star upside down that makes Baphomet and all that. Yeah. Sounds kind of, we don't understand this Kabbalah. Maybe it's the same thing, right? Maybe it's just mysticism, and maybe it's esoteric. It's esoteric, but it's the upside down, the evil. They infiltrated it. Remember when they kicked out Mary Magdalene and the Knights? And they went to Britain or Scotland, or, they went to the northeast corner of France to what is called Britain, America, and started their schools and colleges up in Scotland and Avalon and all of this. They were holding the fort down and keeping the waves of the hordes of the Bavarians back, but Spain was not part of this Roman Empire up until 1492. It had been part of the African, the Moroccan, the Moors. Okay, it was Muslim. There were a lot of Muslims, and there were a lot of real Christians, Sephardic individuals from Mary Magdalene, and ancestors of the 72 that came over on the boat that were from Jerusalem, from Christ and Mary. And there were other Israelites that came over from the Scythians and up over the Caucasus Mountains. There were some of these that went to Mongolia and made the Mongolians, and that became what today we see as the Tartars. But there were some of them that went down through Morocco and into Africa. There were Judeans from they could have been the tribe of Benjamin or Judah. One of them is spoken of there, Paul's companion, Simon the Nigerian, that was a preacher of the gospel, and many others. But all around the world, these individuals went. So in the Iberian Peninsula, the Hebrew Peninsula, there were many of these Israelites. But there was also the tribe of Dan that went to Sweden and then Mundan and took that over. And these Bavarians, these 10 tribes that we've talked about in so many different other videos. We ain't got time to go into that today. But these 10 tribes, these Germanic tribes, they were literally they're barbarians. Caesar wrote about how they were barbaric. They would burn the towns and cities down. They would rape and pillage. They were following the law of Moses, where you'd go in and side. And they wanted nothing but to wipe out and destroy and get everybody to worship their deity, Danu, which was Dan. And also Odan or Godan, which they put in the Bibles when they took over the church in 405. And so they were pushing them out. And they went to France and they were, translating the Bible into English and Scottish and different languages there so that people could read it in their own common language. and teaching people about the great truths. And they were Cathars, they were Gnostics. They didn't believe in Jehovah, the God of the Old Testament. That was the devil. The Cathars were the same as the Waldensians that were scattered up into France. They were the Cathars that made the Bible colleges and Sinclair and the boats and all of that up there in Portugal and Western France and Northeastern France and up into Scotland. And you can read about all of this. And they were Templars. At that point, there were, this is 13, 14, 1500. The Illuminati didn't start until 1776 by Adam Weishaupt. And before that, 1611, 1600, maybe 1590, we have Francis Bacon, who is up in Bavaria organizing the destruction of the world, right? So when Washington came along, he was a Mason. I guarantee it. And he knew about the original ones that came here, the Pilgrims. They didn't talk about this other group. There was no Washington, D.C. There wasn't any of this changing of the slavery and all stuff. The slavery was instituted by this other group of individuals came over with Columbus. And like I said, he brought the 3 ships that he sailed over here was all full of the wealth of these individual Judeans that made the Kabbalah. They were the wealthiest people of the world. And they immediately got here and started infiltrating, and they invented this thing called the York Rite, because another group came down from Britain, or the Germanic tribes, from the York, and they colonized York, Maine, and New York. So there were 2 competing things. That was later on, New York. But from 1500 up till 1776, this other group was up there in Nova Scotia, and they had built their empire along this gorge that today we call the Great Lakes. It was a big gorge, a river that went all the way down St. Louis and down to New Orleans. And they had these cities all the way down. And these were the Arcadians and the Cajuns and the French Arcadians. And they had a huge empire, but we're never being told about any of this. Washington knew about it. Joseph Smith knew about it. That's why they were digging up the treasures, because the story is that the Templars fled to protect all the gold and all the wealth and the Holy Scriptures, and they came to build a New Jerusalem. Now, there's stories that said they built a New Jerusalem somewhere up in Nova Scotia. But today we're like, well, I don't know. Where'd they build it? I don't know. I don't know. Well, because they hid the pictures from us, and we didn't realize that, these cities like Chicago, maybe that was it. Maybe that was the city they built that was the New Jerusalem, because it looks an awful lot like Constantinople or Istanbul, which is also considered a Jerusalem, a New Jerusalem. They built several of these New Jerusalems. And their final one, or, civilization wouldn't just be one city. Israel always had several mini cities, and along the river they would have ley lines, and they would build the cities to match the stars. So, we were talking about Joseph Smith, died in 1844. He was of the same ilk, the Scottish Rite, from Scotland, from Nova Scotia, from the Sinclair Masons that started this country, had the Pilgrims that had a pact with the Micmac, and all the natives were free and treated fairly. They chose what they wanted to believe. They kept their own traditions. Some of them actually converted to Christianity because they wanted to. They weren't forced. And they ate and had gatherings, and they loved one another. And I think they knew that their heritage is like, when the people of Mary Magdalene, Jesus' children, went up to France, and they met the royal bloodlines of Ireland, which was from Judah, and they wrote letters and said, hey, we're the same people. So when they came here and they met the Native Americans, we've got pictures of when Columbus arrived, and he's talking with not just natives, but white men, making deals with some white people that were already here. There are pictures of this. And Columbus talks about it. So there's 2 groups. Columbus came later. The first group were from Scotland, and they made the New Scotland. And they were the Arcadians and the Cajuns. And so our founding fathers were from that group. And that group of explorers and colonizers, it was different from the other group. And so Joseph Smith was from that group. Like his father, Joseph Smith's father, even knew George Washington. They were all having meetings and planning. And when they were planning Joseph Smith was running for president. And if you read history, you'll see that he would have probably become president. And that's one of the reasons they killed him. Joseph Smith went from from Palmyra, New York to Ohio with thousands of people that came to see the prophet from all around the world. They finally came to Illinois, at the far west, Missouri even. And they built a city called Nauvoo, Illinois, which they said was the largest city in the West, except for Chicago. Well, because Chicago at that time, what was it, 1830? Was a vast city. Joseph Smith said it was. But according to the books, according to the history books, Chicago wasn't built till 1850 or 55 or something. They didn't start building it. Well, that's a big lie. Joseph Smith said it was bigger than Nauvoo, Illinois. There were 70,000 people in Nauvoo, Illinois. So Chicago, at that time, 1830, was like hundreds of thousands of people, according to Joseph Smith, according to the historians. But most people don't hear about this, so you don't know about this. This is Joseph Smith had come from that area and was, just like some of the founding fathers. They would go up there with a shovel and they were looking for the treasures and the mysteries, and they knew about these cities, but it's all been eradicated from our history. So a guy named Albert Pike came along, and about the 1870s and stuff, he wrote a book called The Morals and Dogma. I don't remember exactly when he wrote that book. It might have been 1880 or 90. But he started his work before that. He's the one who created the Ku Klux Klan. He was I wouldn't say a white supremacist. I would say he's a huge racist. He is an evil, evil man. By the way, he was a general, like George Washington, kind of the same era, but he was the Confederate Army general. Confederate Army, right? And he was trying to take away the Union, right? Whereas Lincoln was trying to preserve the Union. And this guy he said he will not allow blacks to enter into the Mason Church. He said if they ever start doing that, he's going to quit. He refused he said he wanted to round up all the African Americans and put them on a boat and get them out of America. He didn't like them. He hated them. He advocated just, extermination. That's what this thing called the Ku Klux Klan is, guys. And by the way, he started the Whig Party, or he was one of the first ones to organize that. And of course, that turned into the Democratic Party. And you guys don't realize it, all you people here in the United States, but we've been duped. They took over. So what he did was, he created this York Rite with a bunch of groups that came from York up in Britain that were these Germanic people that were in cahoots with all these Bavarians, this 10, Germanic tribe group. They were in the Vikings. They were the Goths. And so they founded the city of York, and then they came and made a New York, whereas the other people made a New Scotia. So there were two groups. And the York Rite was completely made up when they got to America. There was no such thing as a York Rite. Templars were all from Scotland, from the good people. And the founding fathers were good people. Joseph Smith was good people. But Brigham Young was sent in as a York, kind of like an Albert Pike, right about the same time. And they would go and infiltrate and murder the people that were over anything and, take over their businesses and their finances and finagle and do all kinds of things and make up printing presses and make up lies. That's what they did to Joseph Smith. They claimed that they went in, they had a printing press in Nauvoo that was run by this other, Brigham Young's fiend that was trying to get Joseph Smith in some sort of legal trouble so they could arrest him. And then they martyred him in the Carthage jail. But the same thing was going on in other places. So this guy, the head of the Ku Klux Klan, the Confederate general, A very powerful, evil man named Albert Pike became sort of the head of this, infiltrated it and changed all the doctrines and introduced the York Rite, which is a more extended kind of a modern Christian view, not our real Christian view, but some sort of contorted additions, just like Brigham Young did. He added the polygamy and all these, contorted York Rite handshakes and secret society into the Mormon church. And the reason they wanted the Mormons is because they was going to send them to the West. There are a lot of Mormons in California of the gold rush, 1840s, and Salt Lake. They built a big empire. I mean, they go out there to Salt Lake, and there's just a handful of people. 15,000 people eventually went out there to start, from the original 70,000 that Joseph Smith had back there in Nauvoo, Illinois. So most of them stayed there. About 60-some thousand people stayed there and never would follow Brigham Young, including Brigham Young's wife, Emma Smith, who said he was never a polygamist. His children all denied it. There was no children that ever came along. It's all big lies. They made it up. Joseph Smith said in court with his hand on the Bible, I am not a polygamist, never was. I got one wife. Will never have more than one wife. And that this Brigham Young is going to lead the church to hell. So he did. He went and led them to hell. And they went to Salt Lake and reared up this big, huge, stone, magnificent temple called the Mormon Temple. Who are their Masons? And ordinary people, running around in the bush doesn't go out there and build this. They quarried the stone rocks out of the rocks up there, I don't know, Wasatch Mountains or something. Brought them down with buggy and cart and built this huge, just in a short amount of time. Just like these Masons always do. Patterned after what? Out of some twisted version of some secret society that Joseph Smith had warned them about over and over again. And they murdered him. And Joseph Smith prophesied exactly everything that happened, his death. He says, I go like a lamb to the slaughter. I'm as calm as a cucumber on a summer's day. And it will be said of me, died in cold blood. This man shall lead them to hell. And then he proceeded to give a prophecy of how the Civil War, which came, many years after he died, would start from the succession of the Union from South Carolina and every detail and all the way up to world wars and everything down to the end. So, Albert Pike took over that movement. Brigham Young and Albert Pike kind of together took over the Masons. And made it secrets and made it, they were in secrecy before because they were trying to preserve their lives. They were being hunted down and killed. That's the only reason why it was a secret, where they didn't tell everybody what was going on. Like Christians had to hide in the catacombs and they had to flee and all of that. That's why it was that way to start with. But once the Albert Pike and these Bavarians took it over, changed all the teachings and twisted it and turned everything upside down and backwards, Then they started burning all the evidence. And they burned down Chalago. And they burned down New York. And they burned down San Francisco. And they burned down St. Louis. And they burned it all down to the ground. And made up lies. And any newspaper article or anything they find that will give evidence to that, they'll find it and they'll burn it or they'll disappear it. And that's why we don't know much about this stuff. But stories and truths and legends continue to persist. The truth can be known. There is enough out there. The Lord didn't leave us without testimony of what really happened. There were eyewitnesses to what they did to Joseph Smith. There are eyewitnesses of what they did. You can find out what this Albert Pike did if you just read about it. He was a freaking racist. He starts the Ku Klux Klan and the Democratic Party. They took over, and now they've got the Republican Party as well. I mean, they took every institution, every school, Stanford, the Skull and Bones at, Scranton, Pennsylvania. All of these Masonic halls and stuff were all taken over by this York Rite, but they continued to keep the Scottish Rite, but they took it over too. So then after he was of the York Rite, Albert Pike went through the York Rite degrees and became, the top of the line. And then they put him over the Scottish Rite to reform it. So then he had to go through all the degrees of the Scottish Rite. And then he wrote the book, Moral and Dogmas. Remember, this guy had been general in the Confederate Army to try and take down the Union of the American to start with. He was an evil, evil man. This is why today there are no real, I would never, if somebody would ask me, Dave, should I become a Mason? I would say, absolutely not. Somebody said, should I be a Christian? I would say, well, we should follow Jesus, but don't join any one of their churches. That is the World Council of Churches or the Masons or any organization or any financial corporation or any political affiliation or anything like that. Be no part of this world because Satan is taking it over. Hook, line, and sinker, it's all his. Lies and evil, and they've hidden this truth from us. So I want you to understand, because I know a lot of people are saying, well, Dad, I don't understand how Masons could be good and yet they're all bad and is it Scottish Rite? I've heard people say, is it Scottish Rite? Is it New York? Well, the York Rite, they just made that up and used that to infiltrate the Scottish Rite. So that's how that went down. But yeah, I don't know. We don't have any much more time. We're almost an hour now. And we could do a whole video with pictures and showing all of the stories about the big pit, the money pit that's in Nova Scotia up in there. There is supposed to be this treasure that the Templars left there. The whole story on why it became known as Nova Scotia and how they made peace with the natives and the Micmac Indians and their wars with the British. Oh, they fought bloody wars. In fact, they massacred almost all of the original Acadians. Many of them fled down there, and the Cajuns, there's very few left. They gathered them in like prisoners, and they supplanted them in other different places and reprogrammed them, and there was these terrible things that went on, which we're not going to have time to go into today. But anyway, tomorrow we'll do a little bit more. I really want to get into when we're going to get there. I don't know, but I really want to get into talking about the Ijiji, more about all this Anunnaki and the Nephilim and what really happened and how different prophecies panned out, where the peoples went. We need to talk about the African peoples because I know a lot of you are still waiting for, a lot of you are African Americans or anywhere else around the world, or maybe Chinese or Japanese or Korean or whatever. You're like, what about us? All you're talking about is Europe. Well, unfortunately, the devil went to Europe and took over that area, and they got most of this action going. All the evil came from there. So don't be jealous of them, right? The good white people, they're not really in history. Oh, they did some exploits and some great things, but so did a lot of the other peoples in India. I mean, we've got Buddha, by the way, was one of the tribes. And I'm going to start, doing some videos on that when we get to it and tell you the history of those peoples and Shintoism and Brahmanism. And we're going to go down and tell the stories of the people of the Dogon tribe in Africa and the people in Somalia and the people up in Nigeria and the Moroccans and the Timbuktu. There was a time I was telling you about how Spain was not part of Europe. It was run by the Moors who ruled Morocco and all the way down to Timbuktu in Africa, Nigeria. And it was said that if you wanted anything, you had to go to Timbuktu to get it. Right? Because you couldn't get it in Europe. They were all up there in war and battle and killing one another and raping and pillaging and fighting and arguing all day long and all night till the cows came home. Nobody was at peace. But when you went to Spain, you could sit down, Muslims, Judeans, Christians, all at the same table and discuss. They loved one another, they cared. And this peace that they had in Spain was all the way down to throughout Africa and the Middle East, because, and clear to India. The rest of the world was in peace. We don't have all these wars going on in the rest of the world, but just in Europe or wherever the Europeans decided to go and try and kill somebody. So that's why they said if you really wanted to know anything, you had to go to Timbuktu, because they had a big library there and down in Africa. But up there in Europe, you couldn't learn anything because it was like, like today with the Facebook and, the Goggle brothers trying to make sure that they don't, they control everything you believe and say and do. Well, they've always been that way. So we will get to all the information. We'll get to the Olmecs and the Mayans. We'll get to all the people that are written of in the book. And we'll regather their histories. And their words will whisper out of the ground, as it says in Isaiah. I'm going to go ahead and go. Hope you have a wonderful day. May the Lord bless you. We'll see you tomorrow.